There is a kind of man who goes his whole life being mistaken for less than he is, and he lets it happen, because he has learned something most people never figure out. The room always shows you who it really is when it thinks no one important is watching. My name is Douglas Fenwick. I am 67 years old. I live in a house on Birchwood Crescent in Ancaster, Ontario that I bought in 1991 for $187,000, and which my son-in-law once described within earshot of my daughter as cozy. He said it the way people say cozy when they mean small. I did not correct him. I simply refilled his coffee and asked him if he wanted another piece of pie. I drive a 2004 Ford F-150. Not ironically, not as a statement. I drive it because it starts every morning without complaint, and because I have always believed that a vehicle is a tool, not a resume. The truck has a scratch along the driver's side door from the winter of 2019 when a snowplow caught me on the service road behind the Canadian Tire on Wilson Street. I have never fixed it. My neighbor Reg Kowalski, who is 71 and spends considerable time and money keeping his driveway in a state of aggressive perfection, once told me that I was the most unshowy successful man he had ever met. I told him I wasn't particularly successful. He looked at me with the face of a man who had heard something he didn't entirely believe, then went back to shoveling his walk. Here is what Reg Kowalski does not know. What my friends from St. Joseph's Parish don't know. What the young woman at the TD branch who processes my routine transactions would likely not guess from looking at me when I come in wearing my old Carhartt jacket and ask for a roll of loonies. I own Fenwick Capital Holdings, commercial real estate, agricultural land leases across 3 provinces, a manufacturing subsidiary outside of Hamilton, and a minority stake in a logistics firm operating out of Mississauga, structured through a holding company arrangement that my accountant has described, more than once, as almost aggressively discreet. My name does not appear on building directories. I have never been profiled in the Globe and Mail. I did not attend the last 2 Ontario Business Award galas, even though I was nominated at both, because I had things to do, and I have always found the food at those events extremely mediocre for the price of the table. Fenwick Capital is worth, at last independent valuation, approximately $2.4 billion. I drive a scratched F-150 and I make my own coffee at home, and I would not change a single thing. Now, let me tell you about my daughter. Lynette Fenwick Ashworth is 36 years old, and she is without any hesitation or revision, the best decision I ever made. She has her mother's precision and my stubbornness in roughly equal measure, which makes her both the easiest and the most difficult person in my life to deal with, depending on the day. She laughs with her whole body still, the same way she did when she was 9 years old, and I used to chase her around the backyard after Sunday dinner. When she was 11, she wrote a 3-page letter to her school principal arguing against a new homework policy, cited 3 separate educational studies she had found at the Dundas Public Library, and won. I remember sitting at the kitchen table reading that letter and thinking very quietly that this child was going to be a problem for everyone who ever underestimated her. I was correct. What I did not see coming was her husband. 2.5 years ago, Lynette brought home a man named Preston Ashworth. I want to be fair here. I want to give the man a full and honest accounting, because I am not in the habit of making up my mind about people before they've had time to show me who they actually are. I have hired people, mentored people, worked alongside enough human beings over 4 decades to know that first impressions are often noise. People grow. Contexts change. I have been wrong about people before, in both directions. Preston Ashworth did not leave much room for error. He is 41 years old, fit in the way of men who have never had to choose between the gym and a deadline, and he carries himself with the particular ease of someone who has always found doors already open when he arrived at them. He works hard, I'll grant him that. Or at least, he talks about working hard with remarkable frequency, which in my experience is not always the same thing. Within the first hour of meeting me, he had mentioned his MBA from Schulich, a deal he had closed in Calgary that spring, and the fact that he had recently been invited to speak at a conference in Montreal. He said Montreal the way certain people say Montreal, which is with the slight forward lean of someone who wants you to understand that they have been invited places. I nodded. I said, "Good for you, son." 8 months after he and Lynette married, Preston Ashworth was named president of Meridian Industrial Supply, a mid-sized firm with 340 employees, strong contracts across the manufacturing corridor between Hamilton and Windsor, and a reputation for operational stability that it had spent 20 years building carefully. Here is where I need you to pay attention, because this is the part that matters. Meridian Industrial Supply is a wholly owned subsidiary of Fenwick Capital Holdings. Preston Ashworth went through what appeared, from every external angle, to be a standard executive search. Recruitment firm out of Toronto, multiple interview rounds, reference verification, board presentation. The process was clean and professional, and completely above board from the outside. What it was from the inside was something else entirely. I had reviewed every shortlisted candidate personally. I had read every reference letter. I had watched Preston's second interview through an arrangement with the recruitment firm that I have used for 20 years. I reviewed the board's evaluation before they submitted it. I approved the offer letter. I initialed the compensation structure. Then I drove home, changed into my old work pants, and split about an hour's worth of firewood behind the garage. Preston texted Lynette that evening. She called me happy, warm, the way she is when something good happens to someone she loves. Dad, Preston got it. He got the job. He's going to be president. I told her that was wonderful. I told her I was proud of him. Then I set my phone on the counter and watched the last 10 minutes of the Leafs game, which they lost, as they generally do in situations that require them not to. I want to be honest about something. I meant it when I said I wanted to give Preston a real chance. I did. I have put difficult people in difficult jobs and watched them become something better than I expected. It happens more than people think. I was genuinely open to that outcome. Preston Ashworth showed me, steadily and without much variation, exactly who he was. It started the way these things usually start. Small. The sort of small you can almost talk yourself into dismissing. There was an evening at a company function, his company as far as he understood it, where he introduced me to a group of his colleagues near the bar. One of them, a VP type in an expensive blazer, asked me what I did. Before I had fully opened my mouth, Preston said pleasantly and smoothly, "Douglas is retired. Lynette's dad. He's big into work." And just like that, I was cheerfully redirected toward the appetizer table like a houseplant that had been moved to a sunnier window. I smiled. I took a piece of bruschetta. I noted it. But the moment that actually changed things came on a Wednesday afternoon about 5 months ago. I had business at Meridian's head office in Stoney Creek, handled quietly through one of my holding company representatives the way I handle most things. I was in the building, unremarkable as always, an older man in a plain jacket who nobody gives a second look to. And as I moved through the corridor near the executive suite, I heard Preston's voice from around the corner. He was talking to someone, a senior manager by the sound of it, comfortable and low, the register men use when they believe the conversation is private.
Lynette's dad?
I heard him say. I stopped. Salt of the earth type. Nice enough. You know, he was probably sharp once, trades background I think, decent with his hands, but honestly? He paused. I heard the faint sound of coffee being set down. She carries a lot of that. Guilt, mostly I think. He's on his own, lives in that old house, drives that ancient truck. You know how it is. You can't pick your family. I straightened my jacket. I walked back the way I had come. You can't pick your family. I let that sit with me for 6 weeks. I am, by nature and by practice, a patient man. My father, who built the first piece of what eventually became Fenwick Capital with 40 acres of marginal farmland in Gray County and 20 years of very careful decisions, used to tell me, "Douglas, the ice doesn't argue with the river, it just waits for spring." I have always found that to be sound advice. I waited. If you've been listening for a while, do us a quick favor, subscribe. It's free, and it genuinely helps us keep going. Thank you. The dinner invitation came on a Tuesday in late September. Lynette called, pleased and a little nervous the way she gets when she wants two things she loves to work well together. Preston's parents, Hugh and Marjorie Ashworth, were hosting a dinner at their home in Oakville. The whole family. A proper sit-down. "They've been wanting to meet you properly for ages, Dad," she said. "They're good people. They're going to love you." "I'm sure they will." I already knew a number of things about Hugh and Marjorie Ashworth that would have made that sentence complicated for Lynette to finish, but I said nothing. I told her I'd be there. I told her I was looking forward to it. Then Preston called me directly, which I noted because he rarely did. He was casual about it. The way people are casual when they are working up to saying something they know will land slightly wrong. "Hey, so, just flagging something about Saturday," he said. Hugh and Marjorie are pretty old school. Old Oakville, you know how that crowd is. Dress code isn't formal, but it's a certain kind of thing. Just thought it might be worth, I don't know, putting something together. Something a bit more polished. There was a pause. Preston, I said, I appreciate you thinking ahead. Of course, he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. Just want everyone comfortable. You know how first impressions go. I do, I said. I'll see you Saturday. I hung up. I stood in the front hallway for a moment, looking at my reflection in the old mirror by the coat rack. Then I walked to the bedroom closet. I moved past the back row. The charcoal suit from the Meridian Board presentation in 2021. The navy from the closing dinner when we finalized the Gray County acquisition. The dark wool one I had last worn to a meeting with our Bay Street lawyers in December. I moved past all of it. I pulled out a clean pair of dark trousers and a simple gray button-down. Pressed them both the night before. Set out my regular shoes, polished but plain. Then I walked out to the driveway and rested my hand on the roof of the F-150 for a moment, the way you rest your hand on the shoulder of someone you trust before something that matters. We're going to Oakville, I thought. Because here is what Preston Ashworth did not understand. What Hugh and Marjorie Ashworth, sitting in their house in Old Oakville, did not understand. What no one at that table was going to understand until it was much, much too late. I was not dressing plain because I had nothing else. I was dressing plain because I wanted to see exactly who they were when they thought nothing important was in the room. And I had a feeling, the kind of feeling that comes after 4 decades of watching people show you who they are, that Saturday evening was going to be very educational for everyone involved. Saturday arrived the way I have found that significant days tend to arrive, quietly, without any particular announcement, as if they have no idea what they are about to become. I was up at 5:15. Made coffee in the old percolator Lynette has been trying to replace for years. Sat at the kitchen table by the back window and watched the light come up gray and slow over the cedar hedge. The maple in the backyard was already turning. First week of October in Ontario does that, just starts letting go. I was calm. I have always been calm. It is, in my experience, the most consistently underestimated advantage a person can have. I dressed carefully, pressed trousers, gray shirt, plain shoes. I stood at the hallway mirror for a moment, and I thought, yes, this is exactly right. The drive to Oakville took 40 minutes. The Ashworth house sat on a quiet residential street of the kind that has been expensive for so long that it no longer needs to announce itself. The lots were large, the trees were old, and every property had the settled, unhurried look of somewhere that has always been certain of its own value. I pulled the F-150 into the driveway behind a dark Mercedes and a newer Range Rover. A young man appeared from somewhere near the side of the house who seemed to have been assigned, at least in part, to managing the arrival experience. He looked at the truck. He looked at me. He looked at the truck again with the expression of someone running a quiet calculation that was not going particularly well. "Good evening, sir," he said with professional recovery. "Evening," I said, handing him the keys. "She drifts a touch when you brake. Don't let that alarm you." He nodded in the careful way of someone who had decided to have no further feelings about the vehicle in his care. I buttoned my jacket and walked to the front door. Hugh Ashworth opened it before I knocked. He was a tall man, 70 or so, the kind of physical presence that reads as authority without needing to try, silver-haired, broad through the shoulders, dressed in that particular casual way of wealthy men in their own home. Expensive fabrics, relaxed cut, the look of clothes that cost more than formal wear but have been designed to seem effortless. His smile when he saw me was warm and thoroughly assembled. "Douglas," he said, extending his hand. "So glad you made the drive. Come in, please." Firm handshake. A half-second too long. I noted it. The house was everything the street had suggested. High ceilings. Art on the walls chosen for impressiveness rather than love. A staircase of the kind that knows it's being admired and has made its peace with that. Everything in the room communicated the same quiet message. We have always had this. It has never been otherwise. Marjorie Ashworth came in from what I assumed was the sitting room. She was put together in the specific way of women of her generation and circumstance. Precise, considered, not a detail left to chance. Her jewelry was the kind that presents itself as understated by being extremely expensive. She took both my hands in the way people do when they intend warmth to do the work that genuine feeling hasn't been asked to do. "Douglas," she said warmly, "we have heard so very much about you. You are just as lovely as Lynette described." Lovely. That was the word, the first word out of her mouth. Not capable, not interesting, not accomplished. Lovely. The word people use for a well-behaved dog or a cousin who doesn't drink. Thank you, Marjorie, I said. You have a beautiful home. She beamed. People who have anchored their identity to their possessions never tire of hearing the possessions complimented. Lynette appeared from across the room and wrapped both arms around me the way she has since she was small. I held on to that for an extra beat. You look great, Dad, she said quietly. So do you, sweetheart. Preston materialized behind her. He took in my outfit with an expression he managed very quickly. A half-second flicker of something pained followed immediately by a recovery smile. Douglas, glad you're here, he said, the hand on my shoulder doing the work of warmth for an audience. We moved to the dining room. The table was set with the kind of formal deliberateness that takes hours and is designed to establish distance before anyone has said a word. Heavy linen, crystal, silver that had clearly been polished recently, and probably wouldn't be again until the next occasion that required it. I sat down. I unfolded my napkin. I looked at these people who had invited me into their home, and I became invisible, not because they made me invisible, because I chose it. I have spent the better part of 40 years learning that the single most dangerous thing a man can do in a room that has underestimated him is correct that underestimation before it has finished revealing itself. So I sat. I listened. I asked polite questions about the house, about their travels, about Preston's recent quarter. I complimented the wine, which was a 2018 Okanagan Red that was actually very good. Hugh ran the conversation, the way men like Hugh run conversations. From the front, at a confident volume, with the assurance of someone who has not been interrupted in a very long time. He talked about the markets, about their winter trip to Portugal, about the extraordinary instincts his son brought to every challenge he'd faced. The boy transformed Meridian, Hugh said, swirling his glass, with the ease of a man whose pronouncements are not frequently questioned. The board respects him enormously. Leadership is not something you develop, it's something you have or you don't. He glanced across the table at me, briefly, the specific glance of someone establishing a contrast they prefer not to name directly. I nodded warmly. You must be very proud, I said. Then Marjorie turned to Lynette with a smile of a very particular shape. And Lynette, you must feel so settled having a husband who provides so well at his level. Not every young woman finds herself in that position. You're very fortunate, dear. The table went quiet for half a second. Lynette smiled graciously, but I saw her eyes. I picked up my water glass. I said nothing, because the envelope hadn't arrived yet, and I knew, with the settled certainty of a man who has done a great deal of waiting in his life, that when it did, everything in that room was going to change. I just needed to let it arrive in its own time. There is a moment in any long game when patience stops being a strategy and becomes simply the truth. That moment arrived with dessert. I had been sitting at that table for close to 2 hours. 2 hours of nodding at the right moments. 2 hours of asking questions I already knew the answers to. 2 hours of laughing at Hugh Ashworth's anecdotes which were not quite as entertaining as Hugh Ashworth believed them to be. I had performed my role without a single visible seam showing. The retired father-in-law, the trades guy from Ancaster, the fellow with the old truck and the woodworking hobby who Lynette carries out of loyalty and love. I wore that role like a jacket I had owned for decades. Not one person at that table had looked at me and seen anything else. And then Hugh Ashworth reached under his side of the table and placed a document folder on the white linen. He smoothed it once with his palm, then slid it across to me with the deliberate ease of a man who had rehearsed the gesture. Douglas, he said. His voice had shifted into the measured register of something prepared. There's a matter we'd like to raise as a family. I looked at the folder. I did not reach for it. Marjorie's hands were folded on the table. Preston had straightened, trying to look casual in the way of a man who is not casual at all. Lynette glanced at me, quick and uncertain, then looked away. I watched her hands in her lap. They were not still. Preston has an opportunity, Hugh continued. A real one. His own company. Built from the foundation up, his vision, his leadership. The kind of opportunity that comes once. He paused with the timing of a man who considers his pauses. We believe in him completely. As you should, I said. What we need is seed capital, Hugh said. What we're proposing. He nodded toward the folder. Is a relatively simple arrangement. Lynette's eventual inheritance, used as collateral against a private loan facility. Everything structured properly, documented, above board. We have a firm in Toronto handling the paperwork. He leaned forward by about 2 inches. We simply need your blessing on it, Douglas, as Lynette's father, to proceed. He sat back. Marjorie's smile had settled into the fixed quality of something applied. Preston was looking at a point slightly above my left shoulder, with the stillness of a man who has already mentally moved past this conversation. I thought, you have absolutely no understanding of who you just handed that folder to. I picked it up. I opened it. I read every page, slowly, at my own pace, while the candles on that table burned, and the clock in the hallway marked each second, and nobody at that table said a word, because something in the room had shifted in a way they couldn't quite name yet. I read the full document, the facility structure, the collateral arrangement, the Toronto firm's letterhead. Then I closed it, set it gently on the table beside my water glass, looked at Hugh Ashworth with the warmest expression I own. I appreciate the care that went into this, I said pleasantly. Give me a few days to look it over properly. Hugh exhaled. Marjorie reached for her wine with the energy of a woman who believes the difficult part of the evening has passed. Preston's posture dropped half an inch. They thought they had won. I stayed another 20 minutes, made pleasant conversation, thanked Marjorie genuinely for the dinner, which had been well done. Shook Hugh's hand, full grip this time, my eyes holding his for just 1 second longer than the handshake required. He didn't know what that second meant. I walked out to the driveway. The young man brought the F-150 around with the quiet expression of a man who had passed his own private judgment on the vehicle some time earlier, and was now doing his best to move on from it. I tipped him well, watched his face change. Then I drove home through the dark and the October cold back up the QEW, and I was so calm that the people who know what I was about to do would probably have found it unsettling. I said nothing for 11 days, not a word to Preston, not a reaction to Hugh's 2 follow-up texts, the first polite, the second slightly less so, not a visible ripple anywhere on the surface of my life. I went to Home Hardware on Thursday, had coffee with Reg on Sunday, changed the winter tires on the F-150 myself in the driveway, which took about 2 hours, and which Reg watched from his side of the fence with the expression of a man who has never changed his own tires and considers this reasonable. On day 6, Preston texted me directly. Hey Douglas, just checking you had a chance to look things over. Exciting opportunity, right? Happy to walk through any questions. I waited 4 hours. Then I typed, still reviewing. These things deserve proper attention. He sent a thumbs up. I put my phone down and made a phone call. Not to Preston, not to Hugh. To 2 people, my senior legal counsel and the chair of Meridian Industrial Supplies Board of Directors, a woman named Constance Park, who had been on the board for 11 years and who understood that when I called directly, it was not a social conversation. Full operational audit, I said. Complete scope. Start Monday. Then I went back out to the garage and finished the shelving I'd been building for the past 3 weekends. Because here is what I knew that Preston Ashworth did not know. What Hugh and Marjorie Ashworth, sitting in their Oakville house, finishing the last of that Okanagan Red, celebrating quietly over what they believed was nearly settled, did not know. The employment agreement Preston had signed when he accepted the Meridian position contained a clause, 47 words buried on page 9 of a 14-page document, covering fiduciary responsibility, non-competition, and the use of company resources, relationships, and proprietary information. A clause I had written 12 years before Preston Ashworth ever came within 100 kilometers of Meridian Industrial Supply. A clause I wrote for this exact kind of situation, because in 40 years of building things, I have met this exact kind of person more than once, and I have always believed in writing the infrastructure before you need it. The audit took 9 days to complete. When the final report came to me on a Friday morning, I sat with it at the kitchen table for a long time. Not because I was surprised. I was not surprised. I sat with it because I wanted to be absolutely certain, fully and completely certain, before I did what came next. What the audit had found was this. For the better part of 7 months, Preston Ashworth had been building something on the side. A competing procurement and distribution firm, targeting the same manufacturing corridor Meridian, had spent 20 years cultivating, built using Meridian's internal contractor relationships, its supplier pricing data, and a client list that had been developed over 2 decades of careful relationship management. Built on company time, on company devices, at company expense, in the quiet and absolute confidence of a man who believed that nobody above him was paying attention. He had forgotten something I consider fairly basic. You cannot construct something in secret inside a building that belongs to the man you are hiding it from. Every meeting, every document, every contact developed using company resources, all of it a direct and unambiguous violation of the clause on page 9. All of it documented. All of it sitting in a folder on my kitchen table on a Monday morning when I put on the dark wool suit from the back of the closet, the one I had last worn in December, pressed the night before, and drove the F-150 to Meridian Industrial Supply in Stoney Creek. I parked in the reserved space near the main entrance. The small placard mounted at the front of the space reads, Fenwick Capital Holdings, Reserved. Preston Ashworth had driven past that placard 3 times a week for 2 years. He had never once asked whose name was on it. I walked through the front doors. I rode the elevator to the 3rd floor. I walked into the main boardroom, where Constance Park and 2 other board members were already seated on the left side of the long table, the legal team on the right, the audit documentation in a folder at the head position. I sat at the head of the table. I straightened my jacket. I waited. The door opened 6 minutes later. Preston came in the way he always came in, carrying his confidence like something that had been tailored to fit, easy and natural across his shoulders. He scanned the room. He took in Constance. He took in the legal team. He took in the documents. And then his eyes found me, sitting at the head of the table that he had believed was his, wearing a suit he had never seen me wear. I watched the understanding arrive. It did not come all at once. It came floor by floor, the way it always comes for people who have spent considerable time constructing the wrong picture of a room. The recruitment process, the employment agreement, the audit, the folder at the Oakville dinner table, the parking space placard. Every piece of 2 years arriving at the same moment in a boardroom on a Monday morning in Stoney Creek. The silence lasted 8 seconds. I let every one of them finish. Then I said quietly, "Sit down, Preston." He sat. "I'm going to say this once," I said, "not because I'm angry. I want you to understand that. I am not angry. Anger belongs to men who didn't see this coming. I saw this coming the first evening you came to my house and talked about Montreal for 11 minutes. I opened the folder. Meridian Industrial Supply is a wholly owned subsidiary of Fenwick Capital Holdings. Fenwick Capital Holdings belongs to me. Has belonged to me for 22 years. The company you have been running, the salary you have been drawing, the reputation you have spent 2 years building your entire professional identity around. It exists because I built it. I appointed you because I believed in what I saw. I gave you every resource this company had to offer, so that you could become something worth the opportunity. For 7 months, you used those resources to build something designed to compete directly with the foundation that gave you everything you had." I closed the folder. The clause on page 9 of your employment agreement covers every single finding in this audit. Our legal team is prepared to pursue the full legal remedies available, which in this case are not minor. I paused. "However, I am not interested in destroying you. I am interested in clarity. So here is what happens. You resign today, cleanly and professionally, and this remains a private matter handled internally. Or we proceed through the legal process and everything in that folder becomes part of a very public record. Your choice." He looked at Constance, neutral. He looked at the lawyers, neutral. He looked back at me. And then I saw something that I had not prepared myself for, not entirely. Not the bluster I had expected. Not the negotiation. Not the performance of a man trying to recover ground. Just a man looking at himself very clearly, maybe for the first time in a long while, and not finding the picture he had been carrying. "I'll resign," he said quietly, the words costing him something real. "All right," I said. I stood. I buttoned my jacket. I picked up the folder. "One more thing," I said from the doorway. "The proposal your father brought to the table in Oakville, Lynette's inheritance as collateral. I've taken care of that." I paused. "My lawyers completed the transfer this morning. Lynette's inheritance has been moved into a personal account registered solely in her name, requiring only her signature to access. Hugh's proposal is now a document about an asset that no longer exists where he believed it did." I looked at Preston. "Tell your parents the dinner was very well done. The wine was excellent." I drove home on the 403. The F-150's heater came on strong, and then settled back to its usual slightly less than sufficient output. The October light was flat and pale off the lake, as I came over the Burlington Skyway. I took the Ancaster exit, turned up Birchwood Crescent, pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment with the engine running. 31 years in this house. 31 years of being the man nobody looked at twice, knowing, the entire time, exactly who I was. I patted the dashboard once. Then I went inside and called my daughter. She was at my door in 25 minutes. I had tea made, 2 cups, at the old kitchen table by the back window. She sat down across from me and looked at my face the way she has looked at my face since she was a child. Carefully, reading it the way she has always been able to read it, like a map she memorized a long time ago. I told her everything. From the beginning. The structure of Fenwick Capital, the Meridian appointment, the employment clause I had written 12 years in advance, the audit, the boardroom that morning, the inheritance transfer. Laid it all out in order, without drama, the way I would explain anything else. When I finished, she didn't speak for a long time. Then she looked up at me with her mother's eyes in her face and asked the only question she had ever really needed to ask. Dad, why didn't you ever tell me any of it? I looked at my tea. I looked at the maple in the backyard, bare now, just the shape of it against the gray October sky. Because I wanted you to build your own life, I said. I didn't want you to look at me and see a portfolio. I wanted you to see your father. I paused. Everything I built so that it would be there if you ever needed it. Not so that it would shape every decision you made before you needed it, she cried. I held her hand across the table and I let her. And I thought, briefly, about Hugh Ashworth sitting in Oakville, setting down his wine, working out what to say to Marjorie. About Preston finding the words. About the parking space placard that had read Fenwick Capital Holdings for 22 years, 3 times a week, right there at the front of the lot. I let all of it go because none of it was what mattered. What mattered was sitting right across from me, hands wrapped around a warm cup, crying and starting to smile at the same time, the way she has done since she was 9 years old. My daughter. The best thing I ever built. Some men go their whole lives being mistaken for less than they are. They let it happen because they already know what they're worth. And they've learned, after long enough, that the only people who need to know are the ones already sitting at the table.